I mean, it's pretty difficult to say exactly what it is that effective altruism is as a kind of position. Like all social movements, it's pretty hard to pick out some like definitive statements that all and only effective altruists accept. But there's certainly no in principle reason why one couldn't reject consequentialism, but nonetheless believe that we have very strong obligations of beneficence, very strong obligations to help others and promote the welfare of others, and that there are certain principles for aggregating harms and benefits across people that bear on this question such that we ought to be especially concerned about helping more people as opposed to fewer. So there is a kind of extreme, what I think of as a kind of extreme non-consequentialist or deontological view, which says, for example, that if you could save the lives of 5 people or save the lives of one other person, and these lives are otherwise sort of equivalent, these people will live for roughly as long as one another, they have roughly similar kinds of dependents, people who care about them. There is a kind of view which says that even in such cases, it's not true that one ought to save the greater number. Some people, most famously John Tarek, have argued that in such cases, one ought simply to flip a coin because that gives each person an equal chance of being saved. But I think that's kind of a minority view amongst non-consequentialist philosophers and amongst philosophers generally. Most people think that you ought to save the greater number in such cases. Where people might have more qualms is in the kind of cases that I described earlier, where you're not trading off roughly similar harms to different people, but rather very significant harms to a smaller number of people versus relatively insignificant benefits or harms to a much, much greater number of people. Those are the sorts of questions about aggregation where I think many people are going to get off the boat. But I think it's somewhat difficult to come up with real-world practical cases where that sort of choice is one that would sort of overturn concrete recommendations about where one ought to donate, for example. Well, I don't think amongst the sort of, organizations that are recommended by GiveWell, for example, there's any point where one might worry that a recommendation of a particular organization derives from giving weight to very, very small benefits and aggregating those according to the number of people who can be benefited. I think all of the sort of people who are benefited by the organizations, or at least the primary beneficiaries, are people who are having their lives transformed quite significantly.